Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Good to see you. As you come into the meeting room, if you would please type your name and parish into the chat, that would be great. We'd love to know who's joining us here this evening. Looks like we have almost 60 people. Wonderful turnout. Thank you all so much. Just going to give it another minute while a few others come in. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Just so you all know, we are recording this evening and also right now live streaming over YouTube. All right, so let's get started. Good evening, welcome to the first of two resolution hearings that we are holding in the lead up to Diocesan Convention. My name is Andrew Walter, and I serve the diocese as Canon to the Ordinary and Chief Operating Officer. Tonight's hearing focuses on the resolution entitled Toward Reparations in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. And it is an opportunity for you to hear very briefly from the resolution sponsors, and then to share any comments or questions you may have about the resolution. Please keep yourself muted at all times unless called upon to speak, as that will help the audio for all of us. In just a moment, I will ground our time together in prayer, and then I will invite the Reverend Peter Jarrett Shell, one of the lead sponsors of the resolution, to say a few words. After that, we will open the floor for questions and comments. I will serve as moderator, trying my best to give everyone who wants to speak the chance to do so. Because tonight's resolution has several sections, we will work through the resolution one section at a time. And we will share the text of the resolution on the screen once the floor is open. The text will remain up throughout the evening so that we can all see it and refer to it. But this does mean that I will not be able to see everyone. Therefore, if you have a question or comment, please type into the chat and I will call on you in order. That said, are there any questions before we get started? Okay, the Lord be with you. Also with you. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God, source of all wisdom and understanding, be present with those who take counsel in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington for the renewal and mission of your church. Teach us in all things to seek first your honor and glory. Guide us to perceive what is right, and grant us both the courage to pursue it and the grace to accomplish it. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Amen. And now I invite Peter Jarrett Shell to say a few words. Peter.
Good evening. I am the Reverend Peter Jarrett Shell, the Rector of Calvary Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., and the Chair of the Diocesan Reparations Task Force. And I want to just tell you a little bit tonight about this resolution towards reparations in the Diocese of Washington. I'm going to review briefly the rationale of why this resolution is coming forward now, and then very briefly talk about the major points of what this resolution does. Our diocese and its antecedents have a long and researched history of knowingly, willfully, and beneficially participating in anti-Black racism. During the era of chattel slavery, our congregations were funded by the colonial-era tobacco tax, gathered in large part from slave plantations. Through the period of emancipation, many rectors, vestrymen, and most large givers of record were themselves enslavers. At least one congregation profited directly from the sale of enslaved persons. Church buildings were built using enslaved labor, including some in use now. Assets garnered through this participation in slavery still operate in the diocese today. Following emancipation and into the present day, Patterns of participation in anti-Black racism continue. Assets from predominantly Black congregations were moved to newly formed white congregations. Upon their closing, some Black congregations saw their property liquidated and taken by white churches. Our sanctuaries have been adorned in iconography elevating whiteness. Our churches have used Christian education curricula that assumes and privileges a white perspective. These practices have inflicted material and spiritual harm on both Black members of this diocese and the larger Black community of this region, while materially and emotionally benefiting white churches. And this is not even a full record or account of the harms in which our diocese has participated. This has been our history. It's been the pattern of our present. And if we don't make a change, it will be our future as well. Reparations are one part of that required change. Reparations are a spiritual process to remember, restore, reconcile, and make amends for historical and continuing wrongs against humanity that can never be singularly reducible to monetary terms, but must include substantial investment and surrender of resources. To be clear, reparations are not a panacea for racism. Reparations cannot on their own establish justice. A deep process of institutional repentance and reform is necessary to achieve equity. But nonetheless, reparations are necessary for any project of racial justice that hopes to succeed. In practical terms, reparations are necessary because while money cannot solve all problems, wealth, or the lack of it, conditions every problem in this nation. The massive racial wealth disparity between Blacks and whites has profound negative impact on the health, safety, autonomy, and agency of the Black community in this region. This is true for Black families. It is also true for Black churches. And there is no path towards racial equity that does not address this gap head on. Spiritually, reparations are necessary because, as Jesus teaches us, where your treasure is, there your heart will be too. Until we are, as a body, are willing to put our money where our mouth is, the Almighty will surely regard all of our statements and proclamations of racial justice as necessarily insincere. Now, undeniably, the question of reparations is a thorny one. To whom are reparations owed? What assets, both financial and otherwise, are involved? Where will they come from? How will they be dispersed? These concerns deserve a serious and thoughtful response. It is our conviction that the Black community itself represents the body best equipped and most justified to decide these questions. Therefore, this resolution would convene a majority Black working group of the diocese in consultation with local leaders outside the diocese that would draft a brass tacks reparation program for this diocese convention's consideration in 2 years. While much has been uncovered, there's still more to learn and more to tell in the story of this diocese's participation in anti-Black racism. So this resolution would also convene an education working group to continue researching and sharing that history while evangelizing our congregations and building support for the project of reparations. For 128 years, this diocese has held assets piled up through a history of racialized plunder. It is well past time to make this right. So I'm asking that you support this resolution as one step towards that goal. And I would very happily hear your questions or comments now.
Thank you, Peter. Now we're going to share the text of the resolution on the screen. So just give us a minute. Here it comes. Alan, perhaps you could scroll down so we could see as much of section 1 as possible. Great. Now on my screen, that's still pretty small. Is there any way to blow that up? And while he's working on that, we will open the floor now for questions or comments on section 1 of the resolution, section 1, apology, repentance, and reparation. If you have a question or comment, please type into the chat. Okay, this happens every year during these hearings. No, I open the floor and nobody wants to go first. Here we go. All right. Thank you, Charles, so much. Charles, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Charles Hendricks?
Sure.
There we go.
Took me a minute. I'm sorry.
Yep, no problem.
So it so happens I made a living as a historian until I retired. So whenever I see references to specific numbers of years, I have a tendency to question exactly what we're talking about. And in this case,
So Charles, what's the question? What's your question?
my question simply is, what are the 400 years of abuse? What are the 400 years that are referenced in paragraph 3?
Thank you.
The first Church of England congregations that were founded in Maryland were founded in the mid 1600s. So if you wanted to be really specific, I suppose we could say I'm looking at it right now. I got to think for a second. 367 years. So we could do that.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Could we also say many or a long history?
So Charles, we're not going to go back and forth tonight. So you asked your question. Thank you so much. We're going to keep going. Okay. Want to give everybody a chance who wants to ask a question to do so. Joymel asked if we could share a link to the Spanish version in the chat, which we've done. Thank you, Alan, for doing that. Other questions or comments on section 1? And Benton, sorry, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, I have trouble saying Benton sometimes too.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I'm questioning the phrase "in this geographical region" in subsection 2 or whatever you want to call it, simply because EDOW participates in the national church.
That is certainly true. And we were trying to focus specifically in the kind of questions of what the diocese could actually claim and acknowledge very specific responsibility for. We do acknowledge that the web of kind of interconnected economic relationships around both chattel slavery and later manifestations of racism are dispersed. But this seemed to be kind of like, this is the territory which the diocese can legitimately claim, like we bear responsibility here.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Sheila, for your comment, pointing out that Christ Church on Kent Island was founded in 1632, so pretty close to 400 years. Christ Church, Kent Island, of course, is not in the Diocese of Washington. I think that may be the Diocese of Easton, but it gets to that timeline. Easton, thank you, Sheila. Additional questions on section 1? Thank you, Roseanne. St. George's in Valley Lease, 1638.
That's very helpful. Yeah.
This is great. Yes, 1638. Thank you. Pretty darn close to 400 years. Whew. Okay, seeing no further questions on section 1, let's go on to section 2. Alan, if you could scroll. Now, I don't think we'll get all of section 2 on the screen at one time in one moment here, but let's open it up for questions and comments on section 2, which has to do with the formation of an advisory committee. Noreen, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, my question actually is the previous section.
That's okay.
Would this include the effects of busing? And while that might not seem, in Prince George's County, a lot of the effects of busing ended up being that white families fled to the outer regions of Maryland. And that had an impact on churches because suddenly, instead of having a membership of 300, they had a membership of 100. And that
And
was very complicated in terms of how different churches dealt with it, at least in my experiences in PG County.
And so you're asked, I think the question is sort of this resolution taking that into account?
Or yeah, could that be perceived as one way that racism was felt in the churches or had an
Thank you.
impact on the churches?
Peter?
I would say certainly that is part of a kind of like complicated history of the way that racism and its history has shaped our diocese, without a doubt.
Thank you. Paula, I don't see your last name in the chat, but if you would unmute yourself.
Oh,
And-
yes.
And Paula,
Megan.
could you give us, and if everybody could do this, when you're invited to unmute, if you could give us your name and your parish, that would be great.
Okay, my name's Paula Mays and the Washington National Cathedral. But I'm actually not asking about the cathedral. I'm asking about my former church, which was St. Monica's, for whom was the Black church, was given property in a will, the Phillips Trust, which was taken by the diocese. It was a big to-do, almost ended in a lawsuit. But the diocese ended up taking it, and then they ended up closing the church for membership, even though several churches have way less members. So what happens in that case? There's no one to get the reparations. So that was my question.
Yeah. So to this question, and I would say other similar ones, that kind of question would fall under the purview of the policy working group that's being convened here, and that's exactly why. I mean, the thorniness of that question, being like, okay, it is clear that a debt is owed, so how do we actually figure out to whom it needs to be delivered?
Exactly.
The thorniness of that question is partly why we want to give the policy working group 2 years to kind of sit with this and sort out what's best and, review best practices, but also partly why we want to have that body be comprised majority of Black members of this diocese working in consultation with Black leaders in the region that are outside the diocese to kind of get a full sense of when we're dealing with these questions, how do we best respond in the most reasonable and ethical way? So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Peter. Joy Mel, your question?
Yeah, so as we have been
Uh,
hearing about,
Joy Mel, could you share your name and parish, please?
yeah, I'm Joymel Gonzalez. I'm an associate rector at St. Albans in DC. My question is more about as the current task force will be finished its work. I assume that at convention. How about all the discoveries and records and information that you have been collecting? If that will be available for the new structures that will be in place if this resolution is adopted.
So there's a couple answers pieces to that question. It's a very good one. Thank you. Actually, I know that in our meeting with UBE, as we were kind of getting their feedback on this resolution, they had a strong concern about continuity of institutional knowledge. So we have quite good minutes from all of our meetings, and those obviously would be archived and put over. There's a couple specific documents that we have commissioned that will be made available. One is a history of the diocese and its involvement specifically with slavery from the period of from the colonial period through to the emancipation, which Franklin Robinson is writing, and that will be made available to the diocese at large, but obviously also to the task force. There's another survey study of contemporary institutional reparations initiatives. So this is all of, you've been hearing about in the news, all of the churches and universities and municipalities in the last 4 or 5 years, principally, that have been doing this work. We commissioned a survey to kind of glean from them best practices, and that will also be made available. So the minutes, those two documents. But the other part of the answer is that in the dissolution of the current task force, I've asked all members to consider whether they would like to continue on in one of these two working groups, either the policy working group or the education working group. So there will be members, at least some members, that continue on and kind of are able to carry that information. And then the last piece is that the congregational research partners, these are the individual congregations that have begun reviewing their history, are in the process of collating all of writing their reports on what they've discovered and collating into a single published document that will be made available. So.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Joy Mel. Tom Getman. Hi, Tom. Tom, would you like to unmute yourself? There we go. I hear you.
And I wanted to say hello and thanks to everybody. My question, I think, has been answered. I wondered how much help have we gotten or will we get from the National Church and other dioceses who've been at this maybe longer than we have?
Yeah, so we've been kind of researching what they've been up to, and we've definitely drawn inspiration from them. And so the method by which we are kind of passing this work was drawn from the Diocese of Maryland. They moved forward in a similar fashion with a one kind of in principle resolution around offering reparations, and then a year later the actual programmatic resolution. We stretched that a little further, and we put a little bit more policy stuff in terms of the formation of this advisory committee. We gathered our working definition of reparations from the Diocese of New York. So there's definitely been, gleaning information and contacting folks and conversations.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good question, Tom. Tim Cole, you have a question about an amendment.
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. This is really just to socialize a friendly amendment, which we at Christ Church would like to put forward really for consideration, and we'll put it forward at the convention as well, but I would like people to have a read at it if they would, and particularly people who are going to be involved in setting up the advisory committee. Just as these discussions we're having tonight are being live streamed and recorded, the core of our amendment really is just for transparency for those committees, so that everyone in the diocese will be able to hear the discussions and the thoughts and the process of this important subject. So I just wanted to see what people thought about that.
Thank you, Tim.
I need a little time to kind of reflect on that and check in with the task force in terms of how we would receive it. I definitely agree that transparency is important. I am thinking about the fact that, to my knowledge, other diocesan meetings like Diocesan Council and Standing Committee are not live streamed. So it seems a little maybe perhaps onerous and may have a chilling effect, but that's my thought. I do notice that Maria is Maria Kane.
Yeah, Maria.
Kane, would you respond?
Yeah, Maria Kane, Rector, St. Paul's Waldorf. I have a question regarding the reason, I guess, behind the amendment for transparency and the need for notification. Again, similar to what Peter said, I'm not sure other meetings like Standing Committee and others have advance notice, and it strikes me less as transparency and it feels kind of like supervision. So I'm just curious as the motivation and why this particular, if we can have some background perhaps about the need for this versus say other task force meetings in the diocese. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think our thinking is just that given it's such an important subject and probably one of the most important discussions the diocese has had for a number of years, and given that many of our diocesan meetings and regional chapters and a great deal of the diocesan convention itself are recorded and streamed, it seems even more important that such an important subject should have that. It's certainly, it's certainly not supervision or anything like that. It's simply a desire for the whole diocese to be aware of the thinking and reasoning that is going into this conversation.
Thank you. So amendments do need to be proposed at convention. And in the meantime, as I think Peter said, he'll speak with the task force.
Great, thank you.
So we're still discussing section 2. So further questions. This is about the formation of the advisory committee. Okay, while people think about whether or not they have further questions, I'm going to ask Alan to scroll the screen so we can go to the next section, which is about the policy working group. So questions about this section, questions or comments? So Charles has a question if ex officio members will be voting members of the policy working group. And I can answer that because per diocesan canons, ex officio members of committees do not vote. So unless, I don't think there's a specific provision in here, Peter, is there that ex officio members will vote?
No, there isn't that provision. There was a question about there was noted that among the ex officio members presented, the chancellor, the president of standing committee, the moderator, and the chief operating officer would. No, I'm sorry, forget it. No, there's no provision. That's correct. There's no provision for them to. Yeah, sorry, got lost.
So then, Charles, in response, ex officio members will not get a vote. Okay, iPad 2 Sergeant, I'm not sure who you are, but if you'd like to ask your question, please unmute yourself. And if you would say your name and your parish, that would be great.
Janet Sargent, St. Paul's Waldorf. I just wondered why K under this section talks about the appropriate methods to educate EDAL parishes about the committee's findings. Why isn't that under the education working group?
Yeah, I mean, we can reasonably make that change. The sense was that this was educating the diocese specifically about the findings of the policy working group. So it comes and speaks to that sense of how they're going to share the information that they're coming up with the diocese. Whereas the focus of the education working group was more about kind of researching the history, the ongoing history, and identifying, how we continue to uncover this history of the complicated ways that this diocese and its members have participated in these structures of racism. So that was kind of the sense of the sort of division of labor there. We wanted to be sure that the policy working group was considering how do we, as they begin to draft the sense of what this plan is going to look like, how do we educate the diocese about the decisions that are being, or not the decisions, but the recommendations that are being made and why. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Peter, I'm wondering if you could just say in a few words, what is the policy working group and what is the education committee, right? So not in the canonical language, but in sort of regular old English.
Absolutely. Okay, so and I will go in a little depth about why we are we've shaped them the way we have. The short answer is that the policy working group is drafting the the actual proposal of this is how the diocese will make reparation. And also, these are additional steps that the diocese needs to consider in terms of reforming and repenting in its structures to ensure that we're not continuing to perpetuate these harms. So they are strictly saying this is the plan that the diocese is going to move forward on. The education working group is doing two things. One is kind of continuing to figure out how do we continue unearthing this history and sharing it and bringing it to light. Because one of the most consistent refrains that we've heard from our advisor, our group of advisors from UBE and other folks that kind of have stake in this, is that the telling of the truth of the story is an essential part of this process. And so their work is kind of continuing to unearth that and then share it with the congregations, but also to kind of build support as the policy working group is going to come to a place that's going to present something that will be tough, that tough for us to look at and recognize and wrestle with and take hold of. That the education working group is partly helping build that sense of kind of evangelism around this work so that there is a heart and an appetite to take it on. Partly we've separated those two pieces of work, one because we do think that they're very different. One is kind of wonky and inwardly focused about how do we actually kind of draft this, and the other is very much outwardly focused to the congregations. But partly also we're trying to navigate between two sort of moral imperatives around this work. One is the fact that because these structures were created by white folk and white congregations, and it's white folk and white congregations that have benefited, that morally there's an argument to be made that it really is the responsibility of white members of this diocese and their congregations to do the work of implementing this. That's one side. And on the other side, there's the fact that it's very, very clear. We've heard this from many, folk that have skin in the game, saying that morally it's reasonable that the Black congregations and members of this diocese have fundamental say in sort of drafting what this actually looked like. And there's a strong kind of body of scholarship and thinking around that idea that travels across reparations and racial justice work throughout the country. So forming these two committees is kind of how do we navigate between that? One, the sense of responsibility that white members of this diocese do have a fundamental responsibility in helping to see that this happens, but also that Black members of this diocese deserve to have kind of a majority say in what this looks like. So these two bodies are an imperfect solution to that problem. The policy working group, which is going to be making those decisions, is a majority Black body, according to the text of the resolution. The education working group, which is kind of doing the organizing and advocating and word that I can't think of right now, but will come back to me later, building support for this, is not stipulated in that way. So it could potentially be a majority white body. And so it allows us to kind of navigate between the difficulty in that, how do we handle this appropriately?
Thank you, Peter. Hopefully that was helpful to everyone. Still accepting questions or comments about either of these working groups. John Vanderwart, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Andrew. It's John Vanderwart from Parish of St. Monica and St. James. My question is whether it's intentional that the policy working group submits the progress report after 1 year, but that the final report is submitted by the committee, which I understand to be both working groups together.
Absolutely. Yes. So I suppose in some sense in the first one we could say should be submitted by the committee. But the progress report is a progress report. It's not a list of recommendations. It's simply a sense of saying this is what we're moving towards, these are the questions we have and all of those pieces. So it really defines the work of the policy group itself thus far. But when it comes to actually make the recommendation to the diocese at large, we do want to be able to clearly say that this, the entire committee is supportive and behind this work. So,
thank you.
Thank you both. Other questions or comments? About either the policy working group or the education working group? Ellen, if you could scroll down so people could see the section there about the education working group, that would be great. Oh, and then the last section is the termination. So let's hold there. Charles?
Are you asking me to unmute?
Yes.
So in section 3, policy working group, paragraph 1, section sentence G, one of the things that the policy working group shall investigate and make recommendations on is what administrative or legislative action would be necessary to make such resources available for redress. Are you referring to legislative actions by public bodies, or is this strictly church organizations that you're talking about?
Internal church organizations.
Yeah.
And what type, could I follow up?
Yep, go ahead.
What type of legislative action might be contemplated in that regard?
Well, I think it would be premature to say that, given that that's partly the task of the policy group to investigate that. But we understand that is the reality with all kinds of assets, that there are entanglements and commitments on them. And so like we might have to consider this and to say, okay, it may be very simple and to say we can move these things, forward without issue. But it may be necessary to say, okay, well, what's actually necessary to move these assets and move these resources? And so we're tasking the policy group with researching that.
So possibly convention action.
Possibly, but again, I think that would be what the policy working group would need to research.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Really good question. Thank you, Peter. Other questions from people? I didn't realize we had gone through the section so quickly. So really questions about any part of the resolution or comments? Yes, is that, was that Jane? Jean? Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, this is under the termination section. Are we down to that yet?
Yes, please.
Okay. My question is, should the one that says our sanctuaries were adorned in a iconography, elevating whiteness, shouldn't that say were and are?
Yes.
I'm thinking of stained glass windows and all the pictures of the blonde white Jesus.
Yeah, I think I actually agree that that's probably that's clearer wording. So I think that's this is a good question. Is there intention?
Yeah. So Peter, did you finish with Jean's question?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm done with Jean's question. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm done.
I
agree that would be a good change.
Great. So Amy Brennan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I was just asking if there was intentionality about using African American in some places and using Black in other places. And I just ask it because I know that different individuals identify differently. So when it talks about a certain number of the members of the committee being African American, there may be some members who might want to participate, but maybe they don't identify as African American, maybe they identify as Black.
Yeah, and that is I would say that's a complicated and delicate question, and one that I think there may be grounds for amendment on it. I would like to consult with both the task force and kind of our advisory partners that have kind of given counsel on these things, but it's a good question.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Amy. Joy Mel?
Yeah, I think that if I read correctly, for the policy working group, there is the possibility that they could ask for an extension to make its final report in Convention 2025. But reading here in section 4, or in section 5, sorry, it looks like it says clearly that the committee will finish its work in Convention 2025. Is if there is the possibility that they can extend its work, this specific wording in section 5 will not be problematic.
Yeah, that's a good catch, Mel. I guess since you saw it, I'm wondering if we introduced an amendment that, or if we amended the language to say shall terminate on this day following the last day of diocesan convention held in calendar year 2025, barring extension or something like that. But to make it clear that if it's extended, then yes, the committee in whole will continue.
Andrew, it's John. Could I address that?
Please, John.
I think the reason that it is worded the way it is to give the council the ability to extend the deadlines that occurred during the year when the convention is not meeting. Whereas by saying that the committee terminates following the last day of convention, it gives convention the power, the authority to extend the life of the committee as a whole. So what the council is empowered to do is to extend the deadlines in the interim when convention is not meeting. So as a practical matter, that can't happen.
So just so everyone knows, John Vanderwoord is our diocesan chancellor. So he's good at reading resolutions and canonical language. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you both. That was good.
Yeah, good catch, Joy Mel. Thank you. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Charles Day. Charles, I'm going to ask that you unmute yourself and ask your question to everyone. You sent it to me directly, and I can't answer it. So
I didn't want to embarrass myself with a big question. I thought I'd get a small one, and you say yes or no. But anyhow,
and Charles, can you tell us just your name and your parish?
We have a group. This is Charles Day, St. John's, Broad Creek in Port Washington, Maryland. We have a group that's been working in this area for quite a while, 2 or 3 people that have really dug in on the background, the history of what's happened at this church founded in 1692. They need to tell that story to someone, and it seems like this committee is a good place to do it, to incorporate it. Can that happen smoothly?
Yes, actually, I would say the easiest and smoothest way to make that possible would be to bring you on board with the congregational research partners, which are congregations that are doing exactly the work you're describing of kind of researching their own history around it, and they formed a really good and productive collaborative partnership. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put.
I have 3 names that I can share separately from this. The chair of that committee. A lot smarter than me with the research they've done. So can we do it offline? If you want
so
let me follow with you or vice versa.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to do right now is, and this is just for everyone, if you have other questions, I'm putting my email in the chat.
Right.
So if you want to send me that information, and just in general,
other
questions come up.
Peter, you mentioned that there. Thank you, Charles, for raising that. And Peter, that has me thinking there are other congregations in the diocese that are researching their own history. Can you tell us about how many?
Yes, the number we probably have someone here who knows exactly, and I always get it wrong, but I believe it is 16 altogether. I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't.
No, that's great, about 16. Tom Getman from St. Mark's, another question.
Hello again. I've been doing a lot of research on the Native American situation here in our neighborhood and others. And maybe it's inappropriate in this specific context. I don't remember if we addressed it in the bigger meeting at Peter's Church, but some of the land our churches and schools are on was Native American tribal land. Will there be any consideration of reparations for tribal groups?
Yes. So the reparations task force very much acknowledges that that the picture of reparations does not end with those owed to the Black community in this area. We have not stipulated them in this particular, those other groups in this particular resolution. And we very much acknowledge that among those groups that obviously Indigenous folk on whose land, taken land, our congregations sit have a very principal claim. We haven't mentioned them here specifically for a couple reasons. The first is that we do want to acknowledge the breadth of this picture, which does include those groups. But we also want to have the clarity about the fact that if we cast the net too wide, the likelihood is we'll never actually get anywhere at all.
Yeah.
The other piece, so this kind of gives us a specific piece that we can dig into and kind of begin the work on. The other piece was a very clear response that we heard from a number of folks that were kind of stakeholders in the question, to say that bringing those disparate questions of reparations into a single action or into a single kind of resolution has the effect of diluting or kind of mushing over the specificity of each of those groups' experience. They each have a story that needs to be told and a process that needs to be followed. And there is for us here a specific reason why it makes sense to begin here, is that for a couple reasons. One, in the racial hierarchy of our nation, anti-Black racism is foundational. It is really kind of where the whole project of white supremacy begins, and everything else kind of gets built around it. But also because we have a very, very strong and vibrant Black community that is part of this diocese. So there's certainly a sense of kind of beginning at home that makes sense. So.
I'm well answered. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. And Charles, thank you for your suggestion about extending deadlines. And Peter, I think you and the task force will we'll go back and look at that, right? Yeah, thank you. That's really great.
So I'm taking these down.
Other questions or comments? I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. So if you haven't asked a question or shared a comment, please do, about any part of the resolution at this point, I think. So Charles, I see a question about the bishop, but we can't answer for the bishop, of course. Maurice, thank you for your comment there, Peter. He's commending your leadership there.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jean's asking if the change you suggested needs to be an amendment or will it be made? I think so. That's first up to the task force, and then we'll have to consult the chancellor ahead of convention to see if the task force is able to make slight changes to the resolution as they present it at convention, or if something like that needs to actually be an amendment.
Thank you.
We'll be working on that. There's a few things like that that I think maybe want to be addressed before before convention if we can. Thank you.
Agreed. And I think, I mean, there's a number of kind of small changes that have come up through this in the listening session earlier. And I think regarding the small changes, if they can't be made in advance, we'll talk with the chancellor, but I suspect what we want to do is sort of pass a kind of omnibus amendment that has all these kind of minor changes and gets it where we want to be.
Yeah, we have to go back and consult the process so that we do it the right way. Yeah,
exactly.
Anyone else? I don't want to cut this discussion short because this is really important conversation.
Andrew, if I could.
Yeah, Keith. Keith,
Yes.
could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, it's Keith Rochford, Senior Warden at St. George's in DC, as well as Secretary to Convention. I would recommend and I don't know if this was mentioned earlier, but the task force put on a phenomenal symposium this past September. And that information is on the diocesan website. So if there are delegates on this call tonight, or if clergy have delegates that are attending convention, I would highly recommend you take an opportunity to check out the website, take a look at the symposium to give you some more background as to the work that has been done so far. And it's been tremendous work led by Reverend Peter and the task force. But if you haven't had a chance to see it, I would recommend you go to the website and check out the work they've done up to this point.
Thank you, Keith. Yes, Keith serves as Secretary of Convention, so we will be seeing a lot of him in a couple of weeks. And Mary Nesnick, thank you so much for your comment. And Jessica, Peter, lots of comments just commending the work of the Reparations Committee. Thank you, Anne. This is wonderful. Bio, I see that you have your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question or make a comment? If so, would you please unmute yourself?
Andrew, are you talking to me, or I didn't catch? Or
No, I was talking
else?
to Bio. Someone else had their hand raised, but now I see they took it down. But I did thank you for your comment in the chat, Anne. It's good to see you.
You're most welcome. Good to see you too.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Peter, would you like to say any sort of last words, having heard all of these?
Yeah, so obviously I think a lot of the minor suggestions will definitely be incorporated in one fashion or another. The kind of more substantial ones we'll definitely deliberate on and we will get back. But I'm really, really grateful that you all are taking the time to be here tonight, to give your feedback, to give your thoughts. And I really look forward to seeing you at convention.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you all so much for being here. Our second resolution hearing will take place next week on Wednesday, the 18th. I do know that I think the first email we sent out with the resolution hearing dates had the incorrect date for that hearing. So it's next week, Wednesday, January 18th. Again, we'll start at 6:30 p.m. And that resolution is on planting trees in celebration of special occasions. So we look forward to seeing you all at that hearing, and then seeing you in person at Diocesan Convention